All right, I'm going to go ahead and admit everybody then who's here. And then if anybody else needs to be admitted, please go ahead and admit them. We'll just wait maybe another 30 seconds.
Welcome, everyone. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat by saying like your name and where you're calling in from.
Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending our first annual #PFAS.com event. I'm Jamie DeWitt from East Carolina University. I'm one of the co-organizers of this event. I'd like to introduce Maya Fitzstevens. She's another co-organizer of the event, so she just waved on the screen there. I'd also like to introduce the other co-organizers of the event. We have Anna Sale from Green Science Policy Institute. She's a science and policy consultant. We have Shayna Casper, who's from Community Action Works. She's a water program director. We have Teresa Gillette from the US EPA. She's a postdoctoral trainee. We have Grace Campbell. She is from North Carolina State University. She's a community engagement coordinator. And then we have Rebecca Aker from AAAS, from the Center for Scientific Evidence and Policy Issues. She's a project director. So thank you to all of them for helping to organize. We'd also like to thank some of the sponsors, the Superfund Research Centers, the NCSU Center for Environmental and Health Effects of PFAS, and then the University of Rhode Island Sources, Transport, Exposure, and Effects of PFAS. We'd also like to thank the Green Science Policy Institute, Community Action Works, Silent Spring Institute, and the AAAS Epicenter for helping to organize this event. So one of the reasons that we all organized this event was that we all participated in a communication event sponsored by the Green Science Policy Institute. And we were talking about how to become better communicators as scientists, as activists, as community members. And we realized that there were lots of training opportunities for scientists to learn how to communicate with other scientists, and for scientists to learn how to communicate with the media, but there weren't really training opportunities for scientists to learn to become better communicators with community members, especially those living in PFAS impacted communities. I recently had a chat with a woman who lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who lives in a PFAS impacted community. And she said, yeah, I never realized that I'd be spending many of my days teaching scientists how to speak to real people. So I think we all get caught up in learning the language of our disciplines, and we sometimes forget that we still need to communicate to diverse audiences with diverse educational backgrounds and needs and interests. And so it's really important that we gain the tools to communicate with very broad audiences. And that's the goal of this event tonight. So tonight, we're going to hear from some experts about how to communicate. You know, basic science communication, PFAS communication, and then what it's like to communicate between scientists and community members. But before we get into the details, I want to go over a few brief logistics. Remember that this event is being recorded, so what you say and do will be recorded in perpetuity. Please keep yourself on mute during the talks of our speakers out of respect for them and everybody else. If you have any questions or ideas, please feel free to enter those into the chat. And during the question and answer session after each of our speakers, go ahead and indicate in the chat that you have a question, and then you can unmute yourself to ask the question. So you can ask your question verbally. Before I introduce our first speaker, does anybody have any specific questions? Do any of our organizers need to say anything else? All right, with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker this evening. It is Dr. Ariana N from North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics in Durham. She also completed her education and postdoctoral training at Duke University. She's very interested in teaching outreach and science communication with the goal of connecting these to make science accessible to everyone. So as I said, it's my pleasure to welcome her here tonight to talk about science communication.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. I am happy to be here. So 20 minutes goes by pretty quickly. So I've kind of paired what I would normally present to scientists in like an hour-long science communication workshop into the main pieces that I'd say are the most important. And so kind of just a little bit of extra background about me. I did my like Jamie said, my PhD in biology at Duke, and then I did my postdoctoral training there as well with the Initiative for Science and Society. In undergrad, I got into research studying carnivorous pitcher plants and how they produce their digestive enzymes. So just like you and your gut produce enzymes so you can digest your food, pitcher plants produce digestive enzymes so that they can digest their food. And so my job was figuring out how that process works. And then I kind of continued that trend of studying funky plants for my PhD, and I studied these teeny tiny ferns known as azolla. And inside their leaves, they have this pocket that is jam-packed with a special kind of bacteria that produces nitrogen. And so it's like in their stomachs, they have their own little food source. And so my role was figuring out how the plant talks to that bacteria to form that relationship between the two. And so paralleling that, I did a lot of work in trying to just figure out how do we make science like that accessible, or how do we make any science accessible? And so I started doing work combining different like humanities and arts practices with the science that I did to kind of follow this path into science communication. So improv was kind of the foray into this, and how we can take lessons that we learned in improv and then infuse our science communication with those things. And similarly with the science exhibit or science and art exhibit that I helped start, we're just looking at how we can bring these different disciplines together to help us be better stewards of science and bring that to communities. And so in my postdoc, these things became particularly important with the work that I did with the North Carolina PFAS testing network, which is how I met Jamie and how I am here with you all today. And so along the way, I'll have a couple of like questions. So if you guys want to pop answers into the chat, you can. But the first one that I have for you all is, what do you think makes it hard to communicate your science? What are the roadblocks that you see when it comes to communicating your work? Whoops.
Would you like me to read any of the chat answers out?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Complexity of the topic. People don't know about the topic, especially something as complex as PFAS, having to explain jargon, acronyms. Animal testing, that's challenging. Audience background and knowledge, niche. People think bugs are gross for someone who works with bugs. Bugs are awesome.
Bugs are super cool.
They are. Words that we use all the time that may mean something different or nothing to non-scientists. That's a really good one.
Yeah, so hopefully as we're going along today, each of kind of the 5 main tenets of good science communication that I have will help you with things that you can employ to work with these different difficulties that we all come across. And so kind of the main questions, right, that we're going to answer today is, what do we often misunderstand when it comes to our science communication? And then how can we improve our understanding of that so that we can be better communicators? And so I like to start this by just like mentioning these like myths that we keep when it comes to science communication. And oftentimes is this notion that people just don't get it because they aren't smart enough, they're not into science enough. And so if we just give them the facts or give them the knowledge, then they'll be able to get it better, make better choices with it, etc. And so in thinking about these different metrics of how well people understand science or not, or what are the barriers to science communication, we actually find that different areas of science, there are different barriers that end up changing how people are going to respond and how you need to communicate to them. But this main notion that people don't get it because they aren't smart enough has created what's known as the deficit model, which is People just need more scientific knowledge, and then they'll be able to do things with that scientific knowledge. And so if experts just kind of transit our knowledge into society, then we'll be able to kind of solve for these issues. And that kind of parallels the second myth, which is that when we give them science, that's going to solve the problem, right? That's going to make all of these different difficulties go away. But this ignores, both of these things kind of ignores the synergy that our choices or understanding of scientific concepts is actually blended with the concerns that we have about the topic, the values that we hold. And so it becomes this kind of complex balancing act of all of these different issues and inputs that we have. And so I kind of like to look at it like this, right? We have knowledge, but in addition to knowledge, we have all of these other things that are going into people's experience and comprehension of the science that you're sharing. And so that brings us to this question of how do we actually communicate in a way that is honoring all of those different aspects of the individuals that we're speaking with? Or as like Jamie pointed out before, Dr. DeWitt pointed out before, like this notion of actually getting scientists ready to speak to normal people about the work that we do. And so what I want you to imagine as we're going through these next couple of slides is I want you to think about the community of people that you might be speaking to and sharing your work with. I want you to think about where they live, what they want and care about, what they have, and kind of envision what's this community like or individual like that you might be talking to. And then you can pop some of those descriptions in the chat. And so as we go, we'll be thinking about how can I apply this tenet of science communication to talk to these particular people. So we're doing a little bit of practice while we're learning. So who are some people you might be talking to?
And I can read these out again when they start pouring in.
Awesome, thank you.
I think these are harder questions.
Mm-hmm.
My parents.
Yeah.
My Aunt Arlene, affected communities.
Mm-hmm.
Family, neighbors.
Yeah.
Young parents who might sign up for a health study in a PFAS affected community.
Excellent.
Community members in the field while doing field work.
Mm-hmm. So what might be some aspects of these people that you might be talking to that you need to keep in mind? So let's say we're thinking about people who are living in a PFAS affected community. What might be some of their concerns? What might be some of their wants? What might be some of the things that are on their mind while you're communicating with them?
Safety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big one, right? Oftentimes when we're thinking about how we communicate or share our work, we're not necessarily thinking about what are the emotions that these people are holding while they're receiving our information, and what are the things that I can do to help them make decisions in light of those emotions that they have. And so in thinking about science communication, one of the ways that we like to set the stage is this notion of there being two different ways of kind of visualizing the world when it comes to talking science. So in our scientific fields, oftentimes we have this pyramid at the top, right? Where we start out with this really broad introduction of the field that we're in, and then we slowly scaffold that information to kind of get to the point, right? So if you're thinking about a scientific paper, or even sometimes sitting through scientific talks, it's here's the introduction, here's the background, here's how I did what I did, here are the numerical results, here's my interpretation of the results, and then here are all the things that we have to do next to actually see what this leads to. And sometimes we take that same paradigm for communication, and that's the same thing that we do when we're applying or sharing our knowledge with communities that we want to speak to. And in sharing things like that, right, even just by starting with this big, broad introduction, we're making it difficult for them to grasp onto something to kind of carry themselves through our discussion of that knowledge, right? So if we're looking at that first inverted pyramid, the point is like the very last thing that we share to them, and then all the scaffolding that should have supported that point, we kind of left hanging above it. And so what we need to do is we need to flip that pyramid on its head and lead with the point, but then everything that we share after that needs to be something that supports their comprehension and understanding of that main point you want them to walk away with. And so sometimes this leads to us having to pare down the information that we're giving them. And the good thing about having these community engagements is that if you give them a good enough scaffold to grasp onto, you are giving them something to climb so that they can interact with you and ask you questions that are going to address their concerns. And so to flip this pyramid, we really need 5 steps to start doing this. The first of which is identifying our message. So what is the one thing that you want your audience to walk away with when you're speaking, when you're speaking to them or sharing your expertise? So for me, my main message for you all is I want you to have the tools to be able to communicate effectively with the audiences that you're going to engage with. And so that message is going to be encapsulated in these like 5 pieces that we're going to go through, right? It needs to be something that's understood, something that's memorable and going to stick with them. And the way that you do that is by ensuring that it's going to be relevant to the people that you're speaking to. So the context of your audience becomes really important in this regard. The second step of this is really this notion of thinking about your audience, which is why we started with that question of who are the people you're going to be speaking to? Where do they live? What's important to them? What do they care about? The more you can do to figure out who it is you're speaking to, the more you can use that to influence how you're presenting your knowledge, the better connected what you have to say is going to be with the audience that you're sharing with. Oftentimes we get caught in I need to make sure that I am sharing my scientific expertise and scientific fact, and we focus less on how do I present this such a way that it aligns with the things that are of concern to my audience. So if you can kind of figure out, okay, what are their concerns going to be? With PFAS science, we have some pretty good ideas of the top concerns that the people we're going to engage with are going to have. And how can you do your best as you're sharing your knowledge to actually acknowledge those concerns that your audience have? Similarly, or extending on that, being sure to connect with them as a person, and we'll talk a little bit about how to do that in a moment. And then also being considerate of where they're coming from and showing respect for where they're coming from, right? So sometimes we can get really frustrated as we're sharing the work that we do. And if somebody is asking us a question because something's not quite connecting for them, but if we kind of look back at some of the things that we know are kind of floating through these people's minds, whether or not their water is safe for them, for their families, right? That notion of fear, we know psychologically that if you are dealing with complex and heavy emotions, that's going to be a barrier for you to be able to engage with the content that is being shared with you, right? It's a barrier to learning. And so if we can be considerate of those things as we're communicating, then that helps us be better communicators as we're sharing our work. The other big thing in step number 3 is this notion of jargon, right? So we all talked about jargon when we were talking about those kind of main things that can create barriers between what we have to share and then our audiences being able to understand them. And so kind of main tenets, right? Avoid that jargon as best as you can, jargon being any specialized language that you're using in your field, and be sure that you're using terms that are going to be familiar to your audience. And when you do have complex jargon terms that you can't avoid, be sure that you're explaining them the first time that you use them and explaining them in such a way that you share what they mean first before introducing the word. So even that just kind of simple means of transposing how we often share something can be the difference between preventing a roadblock from being there for our audience. So for example, if I was talking about the work that I did in grad school and I mentioned that in this endosymbiotic relationship between azolla and this nitrogen-fixing cyanobacterium, right? If I throw all those words at you like that, even if I then provide the explanation of them, because I just gave you this mouthful of stuff to try to digest, while I'm giving that explanation, you're going to be focused on, well, what are all those, like this big chunk of words that were set at the outset? And so provide your explanation first and then introduce the word, and really take time to do that. so that as you're using that word further down the line, your audience is going to have an understanding of what it is you're saying, right? And so there are lots of resources out there to kind of help with jargon, and I'm spending a little bit more time on jargon because I know that it is something that can be such a kind of sticking point. There's the de-jargonizer, and then there's the Upgoer 500. No, I think that's what it is. And both of those, you can they're text editors, and they're gonna underline every word that's jargon. And so the Upgoer is kind of more fun and silly, and the de-jargonizer, you can set it to different levels of language or different caches of dictionaries to try and detect how much jargon is in something that you're about to say. And so if you're trying to figure out how much of what you're saying is jargon, how much you need to pare back, sending your thoughts through something like that can be a good sticking point, or passing them by somebody who is not in your field can also be just good to kind of highlight for you what words are unfamiliar that you kind of take for granted. We get so steeped and so specialized in the language that we use that sometimes we can't even tell what terms are actually jargon versus what words aren't. And so really taking time here can be the difference between having your audience follow along with you and having them be like, I got a couple of sentences into this presentation and then they lost me, and so now I'm just kind of sitting here. The next step of this is to tell a story. So storytelling and using story structure can be really an important kind of delivery device as we're thinking about how we share our scientific content. So can you form a story arc that you're using for your presentation as you talk? Can you introduce the players? Can you introduce that point of conflict? Can you figure out or share the resolution? All of those kind of structural elements can help in kind of capturing the science that we want to share. And so this works because of the fact that, one, it's a structure that we are very familiar with. All cultures have story as a fixture of what they do. It's descriptive, but it also really connects the listener and the audience to one another. So there is neurological coupling that happens when we are being exposed to or listening to a story. And so it can create a really nice two-way interaction and get the audience emotionally invested and connected to what it is that you're saying. And so along with this, you get all of those wonderful storytelling devices like using characters, if that's something that becomes beneficial, or personifying an aspect of what you're trying to share, right? So again, when I'm talking about the work that I did in my PhD, that personification of plant and bacteria could be a storytelling device that I could use. It allows you to use really awesome analogies or metaphors to try and explain complex ideas in a way that's going to be relevant for your audience. And so the thing with that is to remember that it doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be able to get across the main aspect of what you're trying to share so that your audience can grasp onto something and engage with you as you're speaking. And then the last part of this, and I realize that I've missed the slide number 5 that I have here, is really to be engaging and mindful with your audience, both in how you are showing up and the way that you can use your body to illustrate points, which is, through Zoom, it can be a little bit more difficult to do that. But in person, there are ways that, let's say that you are on stage. Oftentimes, right, we will stay at our podium while we are speaking, but we can use our body to also visually orient our audience as we're talking, right? And we can also use their body language in return to modulate what it is that we're saying in response to how they're receiving that information. Again, a little bit more difficult with Zoom, but as we start to do things in person again, then being mindful of their body language, what are the expressions on their faces, or if you're in a big auditorium, taking that first row as a microcosm can give you those cues of, okay, they're on board with me, I can speed up, or okay, I lost them for a second, let me explain this in a different way so that I can get them back with me again. And So all 5 of those things can end up being really beneficial. So when we're thinking about these different communities that we want to speak with, right? Who they are, where they live, what they want, what they're concerned with, all of those things can be taken into consideration as we're speaking with them, so that we have a clear message that's relevant to them, who they are, what they care about, that we're really genuinely acknowledging them as a person, that we're being really clear and intentional with our language, because that's going to help them engage with you. And it's really that latter engagement that becomes the most important. And story is our device or our tool that allows us to connect with them and connect to their experiences. And so I will stop there. I realize I think I'm just at time, and then I will take any questions or concerns that are still lingering for you all. I know 20 minutes is a really fast snapshot of science communication, but hopefully those 4 to 5 tenets can stick with you.
That was absolutely amazing. And I am again reminded of how wonderful your advice is. So we do have some time for 1 or 2 questions. If anybody has a question, you can just indicate in the chat, or if we don't have too many people unmuting at once, just unmute and ask your question.
I'll also put my email in the chat. So if you don't ask your question now and you want to email me a question, you can do that too.
And if we don't have any questions from participants, I know that I have one.
Yeah, Chrissy, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This is really helpful. One of the things I think this is an interesting group to have together, because it's all PFAS related studies. And one thing I've noticed in this field is kind of walking that line between providing the information and not wanting to scare communities and avoid that fear factor. And so I was wondering if you had any advice on that, and specifically like when you're talking about presenting story, if there's a way that you can go about this to kind of provide the correct information, but definitely avoid scaring anyone.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. This notion of how can you be accurate and as detailed as you can be without kind of eliciting this fear response. And I think you approach it the same way you would if you're trying to like navigate talking about a difficult topic with a like child, where you want to be honest and you want to be sure that you're being honest, but you can also say, right, to your audience, I know this is a really difficult issue because this is something that's impacting your community. And my goal here is to share with you the knowledge that I have, but I don't want to like scare you or raise alarm, because it's important for us to have this dialogue, because my work is hopefully helping your community. And so I think being honest and just naming the thing can go a long way. And especially because it shows that you're thinking about them too, and you're acknowledging the fact that this is scary for them. I think sometimes that kind of emotional extension, because it's something that's outside of the realm of like what we do as scientists or how we are classically trained, can seem like, can I do that? Am I allowed to do that? And sometimes with issues, particularly like this one, it does make the most sense to just be honest with your audience and share like, I understand that this is scary and I understand that this is impacting your community. My goal today is to share the knowledge that I have in hopes that we can work to solve this.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
I have one. How
Right.
do you deal with angry community members?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question. And I think this goes in kind of like 2 camps of how to deal with it. There are folks who are so angry that there isn't going to be a thing that you can say to neutralize that. Because one of the difficult things about like emotions is when emotions get so high, we do literally kind of shut down the cognitive rationalizing parts of our brains, in which case it really doesn't matter what you say to that person until you can kind of get everything back to a steady state. And so again, a means of like acknowledging the like space in which they're upset, and even saying, like, because of the fact that this is such a high temperature issue, and I want to be able to share this knowledge with you, and if I was in this position, I like can see and understand the anger that you have, like giving space for it to allow it to like dissipate, or allow them to kind of share that anger, is going to be the thing that you almost have to do before you can like share your own like knowledge. And sometimes that listening piece can become important, right? Oftentimes we're so focused on being the distributors of knowledge that we don't necessarily always prepare ourselves to be able to listen in return. And so if you do have someone that is that angry, then it becomes less about you sharing and a little bit more about you giving them space to like share, and then kind of like just existing in a space with them before you can move to that acknowledgement and validation of their anger, and talking about how you're trying to alleviate these sorts of issues. Because, you know, as researchers of this topic, you're not responsible for the fact that these chemicals are in their communities. You are trying to help with the fact that these chemicals are in their communities. And so I think giving space for that anger, and then kind of sharing that aspect of your job can be beneficial, but definitely acknowledging that before you kind of like share your side is probably one of the better ways of dealing with it. But it's definitely, that's not an easy thing to do at all.
We have time for one more very quick question before we move on to our next speaker. That was a great question and answer pair, I have to say. Well, I know that I have 1,000 questions to ask, but because we want to stay somewhat on schedule, I think I'll hand things over to Maya to introduce our next speaker. And thank you so much, everybody. Virtual round of applause for Dr. Eily.
Happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eily.
My email is in the chat, so if you have other questions, and I'll hang out, and so if you have questions, you can message me in the chat too.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Maya Fitzstevens. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Laurel Schaider, Senior Scientist at Silent Spring Institute. Dr. Schaider leads Silent Spring Institute's Cape Cod water quality research and other contaminants on PFAS and other contaminants of emerging concern. Her research focuses on characterizing PFAS exposures from drinking water, understanding health effects associated with PFAS, investigating socioeconomic disparities in exposures to drinking water contaminants, and working with communities to develop research studies and resources to address their concerns. She's the principal investigator on NIEHS and CDC-funded community-based PFAS health studies in Massachusetts, and is the co-leader of the STEEP Superfund Research Center Community Engagement Corps. Take it away, Laurel.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Maya, and thanks Jamie and Maya and the other presenters. Let me just put my slides up here on the screen. Great, well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I guess my presentation is going to be a little more nuts and bolts and specifically focused on PFAS and about how I approach giving community presentations. Obviously, community presentations is just one part of engaging and about science communication. There's many other aspects to it as well. And I'm really glad that you have this opportunity to think and to learn about this kind of two-way communication with communities. When I started doing my postdoc at the Harvard School of Public Health, I was working in a community in Oklahoma that had a history of mining contamination, and I'd done my grad work in a lab. I hadn't ever really talked to anyone about my work, and I found it really a hard challenge to be confronted with the kinds of questions that you mentioned about, like, can I eat this asparagus growing out of mine waste, or what should I do about the dirt in my backyard that's red from the mine waste contamination? So yeah, happy to share my experience in talking with communities about PFAS. So we've already heard some of the challenges in talking about PFAS. When I was doing work on lead and cadmium, it was a little bit easier. They're like pronounceable words. They're just like one or two specific contaminants, but PFAS are such a broad family, and the terminology is full of jargon just to even talk about what the chemicals are. You know, everyone has their own areas of expertise. So maybe you're a chemical engineer or an epidemiologist, and you might be worried about questions or concerns from residents that don't match your expertise. People in the audience, unlike when you go to a science conference and you sort of know who the audience is, at a community meeting, you don't really know what the backgrounds of the people are who will be there and what their, maybe you have some information to help get at what their questions might be, but you might not, depending on how familiar you are with the community. Depending on the community, residents might be skeptical or distrustful or angry, as we just heard about, which may have nothing to do with you, but they may be coming at this with a history of scientists or agency people not being upfront with them. So they might come into that carrying those other experiences. And this is kind of minor, but one thing I've experienced in giving community talks is that even just the logistics can be tricky. When you go to a science conference, you know, the room's set up, the PowerPoint's all there, and you want to get to a community meeting early. Sometimes you have to like help set up the projector, just like know that the environment's going to be a little different and be sort of flexible in thinking about how the event might go. But despite the challenges, I definitely find that talking with communities is very rewarding. While there may be people who are angry or skeptical, generally I find that people are grateful. They appreciate you coming out to their event or to their community and sharing what you know. We spent a lot of time when we were in grad school or through our work, you know, stuffing our brain with lots of information, and it's really rewarding to share what you know and to be able to address people's concerns and questions in the real world. You can have opportunities to inform actions that that people might take. Maybe they're motivated to get their water tested or to support community action to remediate a contaminated site. And for your own career and your own research, interacting with communities is definitely not a one-way street. The questions that you get or input from community members can inform your research and help you generate new questions. And it can also lead to future research partnerships. This is a picture from a talk that I gave in the town of Air a couple of years ago. This was a new community group that I hadn't met before. It was around the time that we were applying for funding as part of the CDC and ATSDR multi-site health study, and we were looking for a community group to work with. And because we had this connection through the community meeting, that actually led to us including the community group in our successful application. I appreciate Ariana's discussion about like how you can frame your thoughts about your talk and what kinds of information you want to share. So as much as you can, you want to gather information ahead of time. You know, in terms of the presentation itself, how long should I speak for? Should I use slides, like something about the space? But also to get at the, you know, where are people in the community coming from? Are there key points that I should be sure to cover? Are there local issues I should know about? And anything you can find out about the people who might be attending your presentation. One thing I've learned is that good talks take time. I've given lots of talks and I've never had the experience where, okay, you want a 30-minute talk? Great, I've got my 30-minute talk. I'm just gonna like give it. Every talk is different. I'm always fine-tuning them for different amounts of time, for different audience. And with PFAS, things keep changing. State guidelines change. There are new news stories coming out, and people, like what people are thinking about might change. So it always takes time. So just like knowing that ahead of time, it makes sense to, you know, put that time aside and know that it will take time to make it really fit for the event, but that it's worthwhile. I would recommend, you know, practicing your talk. You really want your slides to just go with what you're saying. It's really about the story and the narrative. It's frustrating when maybe you need to send in your slides a couple of weeks ahead of time. I find that I like to practice like the day before to have it fresh in my mind. And you really want those slides to reinforce what you're trying to say. I know with Zoom, it's really easy to be looking at the screen and maybe have your notes there. I try to avoid that. I don't really write out my notes. I like to get to the point where I look at a slide and I know what my key points are, but it doesn't roll off my tongue the same way every time. You want it to sound like a conversation and not just something that's memorized. And really try to avoid reading notes, especially when you're in person. You want to gauge the room and make eye contact with people and get a sense of whether they're following along with you. Some thoughts about how I try to, create an interesting narrative. Again, I try to think about what the points are that I want to say, and then how the slides can reinforce that. Try to learn about any recent news or events in their community. And then just my process, sometimes instead of starting with a presentation and my screen on, I turn my screen off and just get a piece of paper and kind of like sketch out an order for key points I want to say. Sometimes I go for a walk and just like have my phone and record myself talking, and just to kind of make the flow of information more conversational. And I don't do this necessarily when I'm sitting in front of my computer, but kind of at random times I'm thinking about like, how do I want to convey some key point? However, you can kind of come up with creative ideas to illustrate key things. I try to do that, and it's not always a kind of linear process for how to be creative about that. This is probably more general, just like pet peeves about PowerPoint, but really you want to avoid small font. I have never been to a talk where I've thought, wow, their font is really too big. But I often think people's font is too small. And especially in a community setting, like sometimes the projector's not great, or you're projecting on a wall or whatever. So I can't say it enough times, please just use bigger font. Keep your bullet points short, because they should listen to you and not be trying to like read a whole paragraph while you're talking. I do include graphs in community presentations. It depends kind of how much time you have, maybe the familiarity your audience has, but I keep them simple. I'll go through some example slides later. I like annotate them. I put text boxes on, I color code them, because if you're at a conference and you throw up a graph, your audience goes, oh, okay, I get it. And if you're at a community meeting, if you put up a graph, that just may make things more complicated. So really think about what the key points are you want to convey. I'm kind of sparing with colors, and I try to use them intentionally. And, from slide to slide, maybe the same color can mean like if you have two doses that you're talking about, like a low dose or high dose, like use those colors in the same way, and not be too colorful, because that can be distracting. Similarly, I'm pretty sparing with animation. I might use it for kind of walking through a timeline or something, but for the most part, I like to kind of put all the information up there. People can kind of read it at their leisure. And yeah, try not to do too much with the animation. We've talked a little bit already about how the jargon is confusing, and I try to really keep in mind, like if you didn't know anything about PFAS and you saw this list, you would have no idea that one of these is different than the other ones. So even though it's a little redundant to say something like PFAS chemicals, like I try to use that phrase to highlight like that's the whole family. And then I really try to avoid as much as possible, like relying on people to remember any specific chemical names, because it's just really hard to keep them all straight, and they really all sound the same. I also find it tricky, the pronunciation. Like a lot of people say PFAS, but I've also heard people say PFAS to represent the whole family. And then you've got PFOS, which people also say PFAS. So, I just recognize that that's confusing. We can't kind of start from scratch and come up with a different way of calling all these chemicals, but just recognize that people might say things in different ways and might have heard things in different ways. And it's also tricky, like different states are regulating chemicals either individually or in different combinations. Here in Massachusetts, the state is regulating what they call PFAS 6. So that's just the total amount of 6 chemicals, and they don't get into all the different individual chemicals. So I'd say like the take home point is explain what you're talking about in enough detail so your audience knows your key points, but avoid any extra detail. And I like what Ariana said about like explaining what you're talking about first, and then if you need to include a technical term, include that second. Some of the questions that I hear about a lot when I'm talking about PFAS is about drinking water. And it doesn't matter what I'm talking about. I could be talking about food packaging or anything. People always ask about drinking water. How do I know if these are in my water? What kind of filter can I use to remove these from my water? Can I eat my backyard produce? Should I be eating fish? So a lot about sort of exposures, but then also a lot of kind of harder to answer questions about, maybe personal stories of illness in their own family or in their community. And, could these be associated with PFAS in my environment? So I am going to share some presentation slides just as examples of the way that I try to put this together for community events. Obviously, how you specifically present your information might be different, but I think they kind of illustrate the concepts of keeping things simple and really thinking about the main point that you want to convey to your audience. So I always start with something with recent news stories to kind of set the stage and connect it with an experience or something that they might have heard about recently. I have usually a couple of basic slides about what are PFAS, spelling out the whole word just so that they've seen it, but trying to stay away too much from a lot of different chemical names. I kind of walk through like what's unique about this family of chemicals. A lot of times people ask, like, are these new chemicals? Like, how long have they been a problem? So kind of walking through that timeline of their long-term use in products, but their recent emergence as water pollutants. As much as I personally love chemistry, I kind of keep it light on chemistry. I do usually show one chemical structure just so people have seen what a PFAS looks like, but I walk them through it a little bit. I talk about a carbon chain, and then I don't really dwell on that because some people might kind of appreciate that detail, but many people don't really love chemistry. So I try to recognize that. It's nice to connect with the Dark Waters film as well, which people may have seen too. This is another way to sort of talk through what the unique properties of PFAS are. People often ask me, like, are PFAS, different than other contaminants that they might be familiar with? So try to walk through what's similar about other contaminants and how PFAS are kind of unique in having so many of these challenges. I usually have something that kind of talks through the many uses of PFAS. This slide keeps getting busier as more different kinds of uses of PFAS emerge. If you can brag about yourself a little bit, I don't know, I find it hard to do, but if your work has been covered in news stories, you can share that. It kind of adds to your credibility as a researcher. I talk a little bit usually about how common they are, and there's kind of different graphical ways. Sometimes people have like 100 little people icons and color 99 of them. A couple of terms that kind of trip people up are talking about like persistence in the body versus persistence in the environment and half-lives. So I try to make sure I'm really clear in my language to, explaining that the chemicals are really persistent, but that they have different amounts of time that they can stay in our bodies. When I talk about health effects, I do try to, if I have time, to kind of talk through the difference between studies in people and studies in lab animals. I think it's an important distinction to make. I know sometimes people have heard like, well, the evidence in people is mixed, and so there's just a lot of uncertainty. And I think it's important to talk through kind of what we do know from both human and toxicological studies, and talk about how we can combine information from multiple lines of evidence. I think that's an important point to make when you have an opportunity to. And most presentations have a list of major health effects that have been associated with PFAS. I like to have sort of a picture with the life cycle, which I sometimes animate a bit depending on specifically which part I want to focus on. This is an example of how I bring a graph in from a paper. So this is from Cindy Hu's paper in 2016. I just brought in one of the 4 graphs in their graphical abstract. I added text boxes on it to make it more readable. I kind of just talk through that as a way to illustrate the point that I want to make about PFAS in drinking water. This was from a different talk where I wanted to talk about different chemical fingerprints in different communities. And so kind of using different colors, even if people don't read this footer at all, they can kind of visually see that there's different patterns depending on the type of contamination in different communities. Many people use the EWG map. I like to add something here that kind of explains why some states have a lot of dots. I think that's a really important message to convey. And then sometimes I add other maps as well to kind of convey, for instance, the patchwork of regulations in different states. If you have some slides that have a lot of text, it's nice to kind of mix it up and have like just one sentence or something really simple, just to kind of break it up so that all your slides don't kind of look the same. And then a few examples of how I've talked about data So this is a way to sort of graphically show concentrations in different wells in different ways where it maybe wasn't important to convey the exact number, but just trying to show 3 different ranges. This is another graph. Again, I like to have big font and kind of like one main message here. And in the header, it's nice if your title can kind of convey what your main point is. That helps people understand what you're trying to say. This is another way to kind of connect the data with a map using colors. This is pretty busy. I probably wouldn't put this up on in a community meeting with people who I knew were really new to PFAS, but these are all graphs from papers where I've like added color-coded boxes on and added text boxes to help people walk through it. And then I always like to end with something about how you can reduce your exposure. I think people often do feel kind of scared and worried, and more so if they feel like there's nothing they can do. So by telling them, giving them tips for things that they can do, that can help them feel more empowered to take action to protect their health. I get a lot of questions about water treatment, so sometimes I'm prepared to have this kind of a slide as well. And then I got a lot of questions about how do I know if there's PFAS in my water? So if your state has done any kind of testing, then you can provide resources for them to look up that kind of information. So I'll stop there. I might be a bit over time, but thanks again for having this event, and look forward to hearing from the other presenters as well.
Thanks so much, Laurel. It's really great to hear all your advice and tips for how to do this well. We have time for a couple of questions. If you have any, you can put them in the chat or raise your hand. Drake.
Hey, Laurel, that was great. The example slides got me thinking because you kind of put in some of the short chain versus long chain stuff. So how would you recommend talking to a community group who may not know enough about PFAS to, you know, talk about short chains versus long chains versus ethers versus legacy compounds, like all that kind of going together if you're trying to drive home a specific point about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess I, might work out like, what do I want to say about it? What are the key points to know? Is the main point, like for the North Carolina communities, maybe you really want to talk about what the, do you want to talk about what the ethers look like? Is that chemical structure important? Or is the main point, like a lot of people just talk about long chain versus short chain, but it's not that easy because a lot of the short chain, it's not just short chains that are replacements. There are these other chemistries as well. So I guess I'd ask myself, like, what do you want people to take away from this? And if showing the chemical structures helps with that, some of those ethers, you look at it and you think, wow, it looks basically the same as the long chains we're not using. You could put that up there if that's what you're trying to convey, that they look pretty similar to the ones we've decided not to use because they're so toxic. But maybe that's not the main point and you just want to draw the distinction between the 3 categories. So I guess I would think about like what you want to say. And if you are going to put chemical structures up, make sure that you're talking it through and letting them know like what they should be seeing there, I guess. So hope that's helpful.
No, yeah, that was great. Thanks.
Any other questions?
I might have a question, and this kind of ties in to what Ariana was talking about too, in terms of jargon. And I think you broke down really well how we don't need to dive so much into the jargon of PFAS, but how can we talk about complexity of a particular site that has a lot of different PFAS? For example, here in North Carolina, we've received information not long ago that 257 unknown PFAS were discovered, and they were discovered through non-targeted approaches. And I have people talking about, well, what's the top assay and what's the TOF assay? So how do we respond to questions about the analytical aspects and the complexity without going into the deep end?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I mean, again, I guess like I would start by talking through like what you want people to take away from it. If you're talking about the top assay, like what you're really trying to get at is like there are other things that can turn into the things that we're most worried about. So I don't know, maybe like what comes to mind is something like a Venn diagram or showing like onions or something like that. Sorry, my son has a question. You know, and yeah, is it chemical structures? I mean, I did have a slide where I thought it was really clear explanation of sort of precursors getting converted into terminal products. And I had shared my slides ahead of time with the event organizers and they said, yeah, that's too much detail. So that's like another avenue to kind of check if you're at the right level, is to, if there's an opportunity to share your slides. So yeah, you know, chemical structures, maybe if you can talk it through, or some sort of like onion diagrams. I guess I'm thinking of Carrie McDonough had a paper that had like layers of what different types of analyses can get at. So I guess I would start with what the key point is that you're trying to say, and then think about how to illustrate that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, Rebecca.
Now I've sort of lost where I was headed with this question. Give me a moment.
Well, I'm happy to turn it back to Drake and Jamie, since you asked those questions. And I know you're in North Carolina and talk to communities that are, you know, dealing with these sort of complex chemistries. What have you tried, or what have you found effective in conveying that kind of complex chemistry?
When it comes to chemistry, I usually throw the question to a chemist. I avoid.
And I did think of my question, if you don't mind. I knew it would come back to me. But you mentioned a little bit about thinking about what type of graph or data you want to share. And I think when we're doing research, you know, that's a really common way for us to communicate with other scientists. So how do you kind of figure out what's meaningful for community members to think about and see in that set context?
Yeah, and I'll say sometimes I like redo other people's, like if I'm reading a paper and there's something from their graph that I want to convey, but like the graph's really complicated, sometimes I'll pull out those numbers and just make like a bar graph. I feel like people can, of any kind of graph, people can kind of grasp bar graphs. Again, I guess it goes to like the sort of point that I want to convey. For instance, like we see associations between nitrate levels and PFAS concentrations, which we often attribute to wastewater. That's kind of specific to the environment on the Cape. So you've got regression results. You can kind of calculate that in a lot of different ways, but sometimes just like breaking it down, like having a bar graph where you categorize things, even if that's maybe not statistically the best way to analyze it. If you just want to show like a trend, like higher nitrate equals higher PFAS, there's a lot of different ways you could show that, but maybe just pick one kind of simple way. I don't know, it's hard because like our research is all about like the complexity, and you know, with PFAS, there's so many different ways to sort of show those results. And again, it depends on your audience. Are you tasked with really giving an overview? Or are you really trying to get into, you know, very detailed chemistry for people's communities? So it kind of depends, but I try to gear it towards like what message I think they want to hear. If it's kind of a community where I think it's kind of a new topic, I may make a simpler bar graph. If it's a community where maybe they've received biomonitoring results and they've seen a table with all these chemicals and they're trying to sort it through, then that might prompt some more detail in terms, knowing that they have had this other information, kind of building on that and helping to explain it. So I don't know, it's hard to come up with like a general rule. I feel like every situation is a little bit different, but I don't know, when you're presenting at a conference, I feel like you usually want to show like how much you know, and you want to make it seem like you've used the most sophisticated statistical methods. But I think really you're trying to like convey key points. And so like pulling out the pieces that help you convey your main messages, I think is most important.
That's great. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Laurel. That was a really informative and useful talk. I know I'll be referring to some of these ideas next time I give a talk.
You've seen them all before.
Yeah, but I've never heard you talk about how you talk about it before. It's very useful.
I've never thought about it. I mean, I don't do sort of science. I don't think about intentionally doing science communication. So it was nice to sort of pause and think about how you.
I'm glad. All right, so Jamie, I'll pass it back to you to introduce our next speakers.
Great, thank you. So our next set of speakers, our next set of 4 speakers, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. In these combinations, we're pairing together a scientist and somebody who lives or works in or works on behalf of a PFAS impacted community. So I'm very interested in hearing about what our next set of speakers are going to share with us. Our first pair includes Dr. Courtney Carignan. She's an assistant professor in food science and human nutrition at Michigan State University, yay, go Spartans, where she focuses on environmental health, exposure science, and epidemiology. She's also leading studies with PFAS impacted communities in Michigan, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Ms. Andrea Amico is the founder of Testing for Peas, which is a community action group that gives the community in and around the former Pease Air Force Base a voice. This is in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She's an advocate for clean water in the community. And Courtney and Andrea are here to share their story about how they came to work together and what they've learned from one another. I've heard both of them speak individually, and I'm really excited to hear about what they have to say together. So the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to kick it off. As Jamie said, my name's Andrea Amico. I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I'm a co-founder of a community action group called Testing for Peas. My story started in May of 2014. I often say I read a newspaper article that changed my life. I learned that high levels of what we were calling them PFCs at the time, we now call them PFAS, were found in the drinking water at the Pease Trade Port in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is the home to the former Pease Air Force Base, which shut down in 1991. And then this beautiful industrial park was redeveloped and a trade port was built at the site of the former Air Force Base. And my husband was working for a company there. There's about 250 businesses there that bring about 10,000 people a day to work. And we had used one of the daycares nearby to send our 2 young children. And so you can imagine the pit in my stomach when I read in the newspaper that high levels of these chemicals, which I had never heard of before, were found in the drinking water, and they had to shut down the largest supplying well. I just remember thinking, like, I don't even know what these chemicals are, but this can't be good. And my children are toddlers and they're drinking the water every day, and my husband, and what is this going to mean for my health? And so I really kind of set off on a journey that I never expected. I'm an occupational therapist by training. I am not an environmentalist. I've never been active in my community in this way, but having this really personal thing happen to my family really kind of sparked a fire inside of me to organize and ask questions and show up to meetings and try to raise awareness and get more answers. I just couldn't accept that my family had been exposed to a high amount of toxic chemicals, and like no one could tell me if my kids were going to get sick someday, and nobody could tell me, like what to expect and what they were going to do to clean up the contamination. And so I started organizing with a couple other mothers that had children in the daycare, and eventually we went to the media to help raise awareness. And so I first met Courtney. She is a scientist and she was living in Portsmouth where I live. And interestingly enough, our husbands were working for the same company and we didn't even know it. She ended up reaching out to me through the media. I had been part of a newspaper article stating my frustration that no one was calling me back, no one was, answering my questions. And the journalist who had wrote the newspaper article put us in contact. And so initially, that's how we first met, which was really neat. And Courtney was really helpful to me those early days. I was really confused. I didn't know what to make of the science. I didn't know what to make of this exposure. I couldn't even pronounce the chemicals, as Laurel was saying. And she helped me understand what science was out there. She attended community meetings, and she would speak up at some of the community meetings. She also came with me to the daycare center where my kids were attending. I was really trying hard to raise awareness there and to educate their board members that maybe we need to filter the water, even though the city's saying the water's safe, we need to do more. She also presented at another community meeting, a community advisory board meeting that our mayor had put together. And she also attended a New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services meeting with me, where they agreed to meet with me kind of one-on-one to talk about community concerns, and just having her support and having her there with the science and helping to educate me. Because there were moments where I wanted to quit as an advocate. I didn't really know what I was talking about. I didn't know what the science meant, but having her as that support person I felt like she helped me. Like whenever the government or the health department would minimize my concerns and be like, there's nothing to worry about, like we shut down the well, it's fine. There were moments where I wanted to quit because I'm like, I feel like I'm fighting against people who are telling me I have nothing to worry about. And she was like, well, here's the science, Andrea, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. And that was just so incredibly helpful at keeping me going. Eventually, my community was successful in getting a PFAS blood testing program. And Courtney helped me interpret my individual results, my family's results. I remember she took the results of all of my family members and she put them in a graph for me, which was so helpful. It was a little scary to see them, but it was really helpful that she helped interpret that in a way that made sense to me and then talked to me about it. The other thing she did was introduce me to other scientists too. She was working at Harvard at the time. She was doing her postdoc, and she had a lot of access to different scientists. She also attended different conferences and workshops, and she would come back and tell me what she learned. And she would connect me with people through email and she helped me build a network of other scientists, which also led me to meeting other community members. And so that was really important as I, continued to grow as an advocate and to kind of figure out this new path that was very new to me. She also, eventually we were able to advocate as a result of our elevated PFAS levels in our blood. We were able to advocate for a health study in our community with ATSDR. And we were able to select scientific advisors on behalf of the community. And so we were able to select her as one of our advisors. And she continues to serve in that capacity on our CAP. And so as we were working with the government to develop a health study, she was able to give critical input into that. And we trusted her and her opinions on what they were recommending. And eventually our work led to collaborating on organizing 2 PFAS conferences in Boston. And we also worked together on research projects and grants. And so I'm really grateful for those early days where, I felt like she was my only PFAS mentor early on. And she really helped support me and keep me going and introduce me to new people and just help me expand that network, which was so critically important. So that's a little bit about my personal story. And now I just want to head into some key points that I have for scientists who are going to be working with communities someday. And then I'll turn it over to Courtney to share her perspective. So the one thing I think it's so important is trust is so important. Do everything you can to build it and maintain it. Be honest about what you know. Be honest about what you don't know. It's okay to not have the answers. Like, we understand you're not going to know everything, but just know that once trust is broken down, it's really hard to build it back up. Do everything you can to maintain it, and definitely avoid this us versus them mentality. It's a really kind of toxic relationship. And so do everything you can to build trust with the community by just being very honest. Also recognize that it might be hard to build trust in the beginning. Communities that have been exposed to contaminants are often feeling very betrayed and really mistrustful. And so it might be hard for them in the beginning to know who they can trust, and who they can build relationships with. So don't expect like, a relationship overnight. It may take some time to build relationships with them. Bring the science, like that's exactly what Courtney did. I had no idea what PFAS were. She had research articles. She talked to me about what she learned in conferences. She helped me understand my blood test results. Like bring the science, and be prepared to break it down and be prepared to review it multiple times. I am notorious, like sometimes things do not sink in the first time. So don't be frustrated if you have to kind of say the same things over a few times. It just, sometimes it takes us a little bit longer to process it or to understand what you're trying to say. But also I will say, don't underestimate communities. We're really smart people, we're just, sometimes we're not scientists or engineers or, toxicologists. So, but I will say I'm absolutely blown away by the community leaders that I know. I call them citizen scientists. They are so bright and they've learned a lot along the way. And so, keep that in mind, but also simplify the information and just help break it down for them. Like I said, be willing to share your network, introduce communities to other scientists or allies who can help answer their questions and push for action that they need. So if you're not an expert in something, I remember Courtney connecting me with Dr. Chris Higgins at the Colorado School of Mines because we were talking about filtration at Pease. She had read a paper and then connected us. And so if you don't know the answer to something, be helpful in connecting communities with other people. Make communities aware of grants and funding opportunities to help them achieve their goals. So if you do come across opportunities that may help a community get additional water testing or, whatever it may be, blood testing, health studies, whatnot, make them aware of that, educate them so they can try to take advantage of those opportunities to help their community. Listen and let communities lead the way. The people most impacted by the problem are going to have the solution. So our National PFAS Coalition often says, nothing about us without us, let the communities lead the way. What you may come into a community and think what the problems are or what their questions are, but you really won't know that until you actually meet them and you listen to them and you understand where they're coming from. If appropriate, offer to speak at community meetings. Like I said, Courtney did that a couple times for us, like some in informal ways. She'd attend a community meeting and stand up and ask a question. And then there was another more formal meeting where she actually presented science to our community. She did that a couple times. So, don't be afraid certainly to attend the meetings. That's how you can listen and meet the community members, but also, if you feel you can offer some information, certainly offer to present to that community. Empower communities to give them a voice and share their story and raise awareness. This one's really important. So, for communities, this is a pretty painful experience to know your family's been exposed to chemicals and you're trying to figure out what to do. I think giving communities a platform so they can share their story and they can tell other people what happened. I know for me, it helps me cope. Like I can't undo what's been done to my family, but if I can share my story, if I can educate other people, if we can learn from this mistake and not let this happen to another family, that's very empowering for me as a community member. So if you have opportunities to amplify community stories, certainly do it. I live in New Hampshire. The University of New Hampshire has asked me 5 years in a row to speak to engineering students every September. And it's like one of the things I absolutely look forward to. And I just share my story and, the things that we've accomplished. And I just always leave those presentations feeling really good. The students ask amazing questions and I leave there feeling like, okay, hopefully I made a difference. And I had a student like 3 years later reach out to me and say, like, I still remember your story and I'm, working for the EPA now and, things like that. So it's really cool. So just don't be afraid to help amplify community stories, because I do think humanizing this issue is really important. The other thing I would say to just keep in mind, if you're working in a community and there's multiple community groups, be sensitive that there could be conflicts among those groups, and certainly try not to take sides, but just know you may be working in a community where you have community groups that maybe are not getting along, and to just be conscientious of that. And lastly, I would say one of the things that's been really effective in our community is working with our legislators to write laws that will hold polluters accountable and things like that. And so, encourage your community members to contact legislators. And if it's appropriate, you can speak to legislators too. Certainly sharing your science or sharing what you know can help, but I just think that's one of the most effective tools communities have, is dealing with our elected officials. And for me, that was something I didn't have a lot of experience with. And, just keep that in mind. It really does make a difference. And so with that, I would say that's kind of my key takeaways. I know I had a lot, and I'm going to hand it over to Courtney, and then I'd love to answer any questions that you have.
So I'll just add a few more reflections on our thoughts on having these partnership pairs speak as we were creating this event. So as we were creating this, we realized that we wanted to hear not just from scientists and not just from community members, but from these scientist community partnerships, to really hear from both sides about how your partnerships developed and the role that effective communication played in developing these partnerships. I think that you often don't have a chance to share about your experiences, so I hope that everyone's finding this useful. So our next speakers are Bindu Panikkar and Laurene Allen. Bindu Panikkar is an assistant professor at the Rubenstein School for Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. Her work examines environmental controversies surrounding emerging contaminants, land use development, and technology politics, and its social, legal, ethical, and environmental justice implications. She's been working on environmental health and environmental justice issues since 2005. And Laurene Allen is a resident of Merrimack, New Hampshire, a clinical social worker, and a citizen advocate and co-founder of Merrimack Citizens for Clean Water, a community group that formed in 2016 to address high levels of PFAS contamination in the Merrimack, New Hampshire public water supply. Laurene and Bindu, I'm really excited to hear about your reflections on your partnership. I'll let you guys take it from here.
Hi, I'm Laurene Allen, and interestingly that I'm in the same state as Andrea. She's an hour away from me on the seacoast, and Merrimack is about an hour due north of Boston. So we're in the southern tier of New Hampshire. And the other difference between our sites is that is a PFAS AAA foam. Oh my goodness, I haven't spoken in a couple hours, so I have a site, which is what you find in the military sites. In here, we have an industry contaminator. So the policy and politics around our sites have been vastly different. We also switched governors after the Pease discovery, and unfortunately, that's been a challenging piece. And I've learned over the last few years that politics really are in the midst of all this. So we learned in March of 2016 that we had been drinking water for many years that was contaminated with PFAS chemicals. Saint-Gobain Performance Plastics is here in Merrimack. It's a ground zero for PFAS. We've been called the largest contamination site investigation in the history of New Hampshire. That I've heard it said in the history of New England, so that I don't know about, but it's a minimum of 65 miles. And the 65 miles was really determined by what the polluter would agree to. When we look at the air modeling maps and all the technical data of the site, it's much, much larger than that. It just goes on and on and on. There was a question here by, I think, Bridger earlier, who said, well, what do you do when you have to tell them it's worse than they thought? I know that experience. Thanks for acknowledging that. We live it every day. It does get worse and worse and worse. 6 years later, it's worse. So when we learned about this, the state of New Hampshire held an information meeting, as often as the first response to a community. It really wasn't satisfying to a lot of us. There was, as Andrea said, a lot of minimization, a lot of reluctance to not only connect exposure and outcome, and I know scientifically that's very complex, you can't do that. I do understand that, but they kept it, miles and miles and miles apart. So questions that people were asking that were very basic were met with the same answers over and over and over. The word emerging contaminants is the first time in my life that I heard that. And they kept saying, these are emerging contaminants. That means we don't really know. There was guidance from the government at that point. The CDC had this PEAT document that really did advise states how to help communities. And I received it on my own several months after the meeting. None of that information was integrated. As a matter of fact, just to give you a sense of what you need to tune into with community experiences, when I looked back at the slides a few months after that meeting, because something really was not jiving with me about this meeting from the beginning, my antenna was up and I said, something is not right here. The slides that they used to give us information about this class of chemicals, right on the bottom right hand of the slides was the 3M logo. So I didn't know in March of 2016 that 3M made PFAS, but a few months later, when I did my own research, I learned a lot more and continued to learn more and more and more, as many community members do. So when dealing with communities, I think you will find that they've done their own research and they've informed each other. Now there's a lot more information out there than there was in 2016. But people had to go in there, roll up their sleeves, because they said, you know, what you're telling us here, you know, by the authorities in our state is fairly useless. And we know there's more that we need to know. And we're going to go out there and find people who are going to give us this information. So part of our journey was, it began that night at that info meeting. Residents lined up at the question and answer session, and they went up to the microphone and they asked questions. So of course came that initial, how could this have happened? Aren't there laws to prevent this sort of thing? Which is my first thought, only to find out that in fact, well, we all know, you know, the policy on PFAS, and it goes back so much longer than any of us ever realized. So when that hits you, you're saying, wow, this could have been prevented, you know. So our polluter coats fabric. So PTFE, which is Teflon, is what they use to kind of cook the fabric and the dip pans, and up this stuff goes into the smokestacks and spews. The particulate from the air is what has contaminated our drinking water. No one spoke about the inhalation of the air particulates that still go on to this day. So think about this, you know, as you talk with communities. In March of 2016, this one community in the whole nation, there's many, 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 learns of a contamination. We also know what the source is, who the source is, and we know it's because of air particulates. They're bioaccumulating in our environment. Do you think that that stopped that day? It didn't. Are those stacks filtered? They may be by the end of July. It's taken us years of legislation, sponsoring, pushing, and they may be done by the end of July. So just think from what you know about this class of chemicals and this, you know, this quality of bioaccumulation, what happens from March of 2016 to July of 2021? That much more contamination. So what's the first rule of, you know, when you find an exposed community, right? You want to stop the exposure, right? And people know that. So people realize, oh my God, you know, what has this done to me and my family? And then they start sharing stories about pets and asking questions about swimming in swimming pools and can they grow their gardens and all kinds of things. So this area of New Hampshire, you know, we love the outdoors. It's absolutely beautiful. And you would never in a million years look at this area and say, oh, this looks like a place where they built this factory, you know, to really pollute these folks. New Hampshire does not have a lot of diversity. I'm from Massachusetts. I'm a first generation immigrant, and I've been, you know, appalled at that piece. It's been hard for me to get used to, but even 85 to now, it's still hard for me to get used to. So this is not what you would define as an environmental justice community, right? The income is pretty good. And we think we have power, but we don't. We do not have power. So the reformulations of Teflon, it's still PTFE. It's made a little differently than it was in 1985 and, you know, 1995 and so on, but it's still PFAS. It's still Teflon. So here we are today, back to that meeting where it all started. You know, the same issues are here. People have the same questions, the same needs. So one of the things that really got me pulled into this and why I became a co-founder of this group was New Englanders are pretty stoic. You know, they kind of have this attitude of if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And, you know, a lot of diehards in this area of New Hampshire. Everybody's fine. No one talks about their personal things and their health. You know, maybe that's a show of weakness or something. People just keep going. There's great work ethic and there's fabulous people here. So what really struck me about this meeting is person after person got up to this microphone and I was looking at their faces. And, you know, I deal with complex family and I'm a family therapist. And the dynamics were just taking my breath away. People that I never in a million years would guess that they would self-disclose were self-disclosing at this microphone. Do you think the water could have caused my cancer? And could it have possibly saved the life of my wife? And they're talking about bladder and kidney and testicular. A young man came up and said his thyroid was removed when he was 14 years old. Another person came up and talked about thyroid, ulcerative colitis, and 2 or 3 other health conditions. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, if you hear about several health conditions from a person, you'd say, whoa, that's really bad luck. Or wow, what's your family history? So at that point, I was thinking to myself, this is really interesting and really horrifying that there are similar stories here. The slides are giving us no information. The C8 study was not acknowledged by New Hampshire for 2 years after or discovery. And Andrea and myself and other people in the state really pushed, you know, and some of the representatives in the Seacoast did a phenomenal job and said, that's science, acknowledge it. So it's been a long, long journey. So lots of reach out to science and academic and environmental allies. But in this journey, one of the things I realized with my community members is all the things that we would expect to be happening back in 2016, nothing was happening. As a matter of fact, every basic ask that we had was absolutely roadblocked for some reason. Looking back, what I realize now is an active corporate polluter with massive DoD contracts in the billions of dollars as the sole bidder. Now I know, what's going on here. They're pretty well connected, and things aren't going to happen for you because the powers that be will have liability if things happen for you. So hearing all those stories about health and the questions people had, it struck me looking at the state leaders, and I said, why aren't they saying something's not right here? These people are giving profiles, and neighborhoods are saying, in my neighborhood, there are 7 cases of cancer and we only have 9 houses on the street. I remember that one. Another story about children and, you know, all kinds of stories. And I was hearing these patterns and I was just horrified. So by the end of that year, you know, people were going through the stage of anger and frustration and, you know, all kinds of feelings that were emotional. By January 2017, we said, you know, we need to get more organized. Our asks and our petitions, we really aren't getting anywhere here. What do we want? And people said, we want to know, you know, if the water caused all these illnesses. Well, you as scientists know it's not that easy to do. Strong associations are great to find. Statistical significance, you need a lot of money. You need funding, right? Funding wasn't there for what we needed. And we were told that we couldn't even get access to blood tests on the state. We pushed and pushed and pushed. And finally, they agreed to do a sample of 100 people. And I commented very strongly to the state at that point. And what I said was, I used to be a stats and research nerd in my graduate school years, and don't let me pull out my notebooks because there's 27,000 people in this town. And I have a feeling 100 people is not a representative sample. Look them in the eye. And a lot of people were like, yeah, good point, whatever she's talking about, you know? And then they said, well, and they looked down, they said, okay, 200, but it's expensive. So, you know, we fought for those 200 samples, and they did find statistical significance the closer you are to the plant. And that really speaks to me for inhalation and dermal absorption and lung absorption, because where I live is not within that 1.5 miles. My water is the same water as the people who live in that 1.5 miles. And we see a difference, a step up in comparison to the NHANES. So somewhere in this journey, I thought to myself, okay, you know, we are the study, we are the guinea pigs. You know, we hear that phrase a lot. Let's collect our own health data and let's bring it to the state of New Hampshire. Then I thought, how do I do that? I don't use technology. You know, my work is client-faced. So, you know, Shana from now it's Community Action Works, it was Toxic Action Center at the time, said, hey, you know, she's a whiz person with technology. She said, what do you need? I can help you guys kind of get organized and figure out how to collect this information. I said, so this is what we want to do. And how are we going to do it? Because we really don't have a budget. So, you know, we worked at surveys that were going to be made with a Google Doc and use a little bit.ly link. And then what we concentrated our resources on is flyers, getting out the word, getting people out there. So we're thinking, okay, what are the questions we want to ask? Let's look for health conditions that we know are related to what's acknowledged, which was very limited. It was C8 study, basically. Like it or not, state of New Hampshire, the C8 study is valid, and we're going to stick to that. We were hearing lots of things from people about, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I'm like, what is that? Now I know what PFAS does to connective tissue, IgA deficiencies, which I found out that I had. So all kinds of stuff floating around the community in numbers that were kind of stunning. So we worked to design the questions, and we worked pretty well at that. And within our group, we got out there and knocked on doors and put things in the paper and gathered this data. So while we were doing this, me, the person back in the day with my social science background, but I did do a little work in this area, but not the hardcore science, right? I'm considered a soft science. But I was thinking to myself, if this is going to be taken seriously, we really have to be mindful of our methodology. So methodology was in my mind. My friends were going, what are you talking about? We just got to get all the information. I said, well, you never know, what we can do with this. And it needs to be as valid as possible, even though we're not scientists. So we really, tuned into sampling and all kinds of things like that and documented every bit of it on our website. cleanwaternh.org, there's a little section in there that speaks to sampling and methodology if you're curious and you want to look at that. So we did the best we could. In this data, basically dumped into this Excel spreadsheet. So what I was looking at is, what does it look like when we dump it? And I looked and I see these columns. We did this by household, and I'm going, oh my gosh, this is going to be beastly to analyze. And then I'm thinking to myself, well, who's going to analyze this? You don't know how to analyze this. Years ago, I used StatQuest on a 5-inch floppy drive. So I'm dating myself if anybody knows how far back that goes. And I know they don't even, so I had no idea what we were going to do with this, but I could see that it was going to be really hard to do anything other than descriptive statistics, which we could sort and we could look at bar graphs. So we did that and we took it back to the community, and the community really responded to this. We had some reporters and media people there. They reported on this very responsibly. It was published and it was no longer exists. The corporation basically sent them letters and had them take it down. One media person who covered a lot of our work actually left New Hampshire very quietly without saying goodbye. So I really do wonder about that. So we end up with the community meeting, and then we go to the state and we say, look at this and look at the combinations of, conditions. And what do they say? They look at this and I think, what's the best way to show them what I want them to see? So I said, well, let's do something really stupid. Let's print out the health conditions alphabetically in groups. And can we sort it so if it starts with A, it'll have any coexisting conditions across the same line? So the co-founder of our group is a total computer nerd. And she said, I'll figure it out. So she figured out how to get that done. A huge stack of pages. We had a decent sample size, and it wasn't just, there is a self-selecting bias, but basically we had people who partook in this we called it a health survey, because I'm like, can we call it a study? We're not scientists, so we called it what we will. People did participate in it who said, I don't really think this is a problem, and I'll give you my information. So we didn't disinclude them, so we did have folks in there who basically didn't have much to report. It was self-report. So basically, we take this dumping, if you will, to the state of New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services. We sit down, we talk about, people talk. We have 7 people with us. They share stories in various neighborhoods. They tell them what they see. They tell them what their concerns are. And then I take out this document and I said, look, I want you to look at these patterns. If I said to you, there's this immense amount of cases of high cholesterol, what does that really mean? How do you know where people get high cholesterol? But if I told you that these folks with cholesterol have disordered thyroids and ulcerative colitis, I didn't really know much about ulcerative colitis, but I know it's in the C8 study. So I said, so look at the patterns here. These patterns really do warrant you finding us some help, and we need this looked at. we need guidance and we need some answers. So they kind of glanced at it, and the person there leading it looked a little nervous. And then he said, well, and he's thinking what to say. And he said, this isn't very scientific. I had to bite my tongue because what was coming out of my tongue, pardon my French, was no shit, because you could do the science if somebody else can, and we're people. So I kept my cool and I said, well, I said, it is capturing some patterns that are definitely trouble. Look at page 18, look at page 35. He wasn't looking, he didn't flip through, he just looked nervous. And, you know, it was kind of interesting. So at that point, you know, we had raised the visibility. People who participated in this and helped us get out the word became our leadership team. So we pulled them more into more solidarity in our group, which was phenomenal, became more determined, but then more frustrated. So like, what are we going to do now? And I said, we need somebody to analyze this for us. It's, you know, how are they going to do that? Academics and scientists are very busy and they have grants that they're working on and so much other stuff. The universities in the state here were not able to do that. There were some interesting reasons as to why they couldn't, but that's, you know, there are associations and contracts they work on with the state. So I think it's very interesting, this site, what we can do and what we can't do. So I turned to Shayna and I said, all right, do you know anybody, you know, who could help us? And she's like, let me work on that. So evidently, I think the story goes that Shayna met up with Bindu and they took a walk, and she said, let me tell you a little bit more about Merrimack. Now, Bindu was very familiar with the Bennington story and also Hoosick Falls. And you may or may not know this, but the Saint-Gobain same management that is my polluter is the same polluter and the same processes in Bennington and in Hoosick Falls. All three of us share that. Bennington, they closed down in there, and Saint-Gobain increased and actually added stacks to their facility in 2003 in Merrimack because Vermont said, hey, you're putting air controls on that stuff. It's bad news. And they came here because of this low regulatory live free or die state. So, you know, meeting Bindu was absolutely phenomenal. And we ended up working together for quite some time and communicating over what ended up not just analysis of data, and we had a webinar to present that to folks, but also a publication that we did together. And I'll let you tell her about that part of Bindu tell you about that part of the journey from her point of view as a scientist. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm pretty sure that all of you are pretty tired and might be thinking of wrapping up the evening. So nice to meet you all. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk. I could personally have, just listen to Laurene maybe forever. I have been in awe of Laurene ever since I first talked to her because of her expertise, her community skills, the way that she deals with the community, her understanding of things, her concerns for her community, all of that really kind of stuck with me the first time I talked to her. But before that, just a little bit about myself. I feel like there are a lot of parallels between my story and the story that Courtney actually shared. So I did my PhD at Tufts, also from the Boston area. Actually have taken some courses at Boston University with actually Dick Clapp. So all of these people, the same group of people, have actually inspired and really nourished me to do the kind of work that I have done. So my PhD was in environmental health, but right from the get-go, I have been interested in doing community-based research, and my work has strongly combined environmental justice issues. So when I started my journey at Tufts, I started by doing a full-fledged community-based participatory research looking into immigrant occupational health issues in Somerville, where we actually collaborated with 5 or 6 different organizations. This work emerged after, a fire that resulted in Somerville from using floor sanders or using these a volatile explosive chemical that ended up, burning the whole house, and also sadly killing 2 of the workers in the house, Vietnamese workers. So that kind of galvanized, a lot of interest in the community, and we ended up working with the local, many of the immigrant organizations in the area. So after that, amazing experience, I continued this trajectory of research with Phil Brown, initially at Brown University and then at Northeastern University. So I actually was fortunate enough to actually learn from these great people. And while working with Phil, I got to learn about the C8 study because he was really working partly on some of those issues. Though he is a sociologist, he's been largely looking into health social movements, but also we started some work looking into biomonitoring report back program, and so. That was my entry into the real world of PFAS to some extent. And so I worked with Phil for about 4 years, and then I actually left for a little bit, and then I got my job here at University of Vermont. And so Burlington was a new place for me, and I didn't actually know where to start. Initial interest was to start environmental justice study, but then, Shana, who I've also I've worked with Toxics Action Center before, so Shana was essentially a lifeline for me to kind of start really getting back into doing environmental health and environmental justice-based research in Vermont, because I am in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources in the Environmental Studies program. Not many people in the school actually do environmental health related work. So, I got to know about Merrimack definitely through Shana, but also I was, like Laurene said, I was aware of what was actually happening in Bennington, Vermont. And so that history was, really troubling in many ways, but to also hear that that was actually, the whole situation being transferred to Merrimack, New Hampshire, was even a greater concern to some extent. So, for me, thinking about doing community-based research, or even doing effective community-university partnership, the key thing that, at least in how I do things, is that I always let the community lead first, because I feel like I have something to learn before I even go in, because there is a lot of history. So maybe this is the social science background. But first, you have to learn the context, the history, the what has already transpired. So you already listened to what Laurene was actually talking about in terms of like the history that has happened since 2016, since the day that she learned about this at that first state meeting, and everything that has actually transpired since then. And the fact that the state was actually using the slides prepared by 3M, how trustworthy are these? So these are important background context that is really central to, understanding our working relationship, because without, knowing that, I do not have a place to actually understand what exactly is actually happening in this particular place. So connecting over history, connecting over stories is definitely an important first step. And again, like I said, understanding what is the problem at hand. So we know that many of the political problems of the day actually stem from, climate change, industrial pollution, all of that. So still, even so, there isn't enough political will to address these situations and issues, just like in, Merrimack. So while and all that time, since 2016, now it's 2021, communities are being exposed to harmful environmental contaminants, which have strong health implications. So for me, I was happy that, that is where our work intersected. I'm really interested in, community health issues, and also I love doing good community-based surveys, actually. That is something that I love doing, because it's to me, it's a little bit about learning individual stories that people share, even if it is in a questionnaire format. So even if I didn't go to each of the household and do those surveys, I actually learned from every single data point, and all the 200 plus households that they went to. Eventually, they actually talked to about 5, at times 2 or 3 people in each of the households. So that kind of increased the number of individuals in the survey that we did, in the survey that Laurene had done. So so some of the key things to keep in mind is that groups such as this and the social movements actually are particularly relevant in today's globalized industrial world, especially as they focus on trying to make change on the ground. Be it related to industrial practice, how do you hold them accountable? How do you, ask for equitable, just, and sustainable practices? So, communities are treated with respect, and they're not, subject to ongoing, pollution and exposures. So, social movements, and especially community movements and groups, grapple with a lot of issues, and scientific expertise and technological design especially, are also involved in the regulation of industrial systems. So frequently, there are sharp disagreements over meaning of science and its relevance for policy, as Laurene has actually talked about. There might be disagreements about, what the state is actually sharing. But there are areas of, research that are, potentially valuable to, especially groups like Laurene's. that are at times the state does not back them to do the kind of research that the community actually wants, especially that of health outcomes and exposures. The same story. This is the same story actually in Bennington. So if you talk to the community members there, they were interested in doing health studies, but of course, the state was not behind supporting a health study. So at times, oftentimes, there is a systematic, absence of research, on these issues that the community groups cannot use to galvanize their case or to make their point across to the state officials. So as a result, they cannot prove, the potential risk, the health outcomes, so you kind of wallow in a lot of uncertainties and a lot of unknown risks. So there is actually a theoretical concept called undone science, which actually talks about this, a particular issue of, there is often desired research that the community wants to be done, but it is actually significantly underfunded and significantly or systematically ignored. And so this absence of research is actually often in contrast with the industry funds a lot of research, but never to support the community interests. So looks like I don't have that much time, but the basic thing that I wanted to share is that so the best strategies for successfully mobilizing support and bringing about policy change in the industry actually require good scientific evidence and resources to conduct the science. And oftentimes if you wait to get funded to do that particular health study, probably it's not going to happen. For example, Laurene and we've already applied for a couple of NIH grants, and we also have applied for another EPSCoR grant. None of them have actually come through. So you can wait forever to do studies like this. But there is a sense of urgency, because what we have done, what Laurene has actually done, is that she didn't actually wait. She took the initiative. She got the help that she needed. I'm glad that I was able to learn from her and to do this work with her so that she can actually go on and do the work that she wants to do in the state to show what exactly is happening in the state. So that documentation in time is meaningful, right? So the study is not perfect by any means, but it is a document that actually kind of shows the real complexities, the real challenges that the communities are actually dealing with. So in short, everyone should think about why we should not wait to do a health study in situations like this, even if it is just documenting it, because an official health study isn't coming anytime soon, and if we don't collect our own data, it might never get collected. So it's also important to do such things to validate the concern of the residents who feel invisible and abandoned. And conducting a health survey brings more involvement and voice voices into your movement, and also to utilize the opportunity to introduce more health research and PFAS fact sheets into the community awareness, because as you're doing the health survey, it's an opportunity to talk to more people about these issues and to talk about exposures, how they're being impacted by it. It's an opportunity to utilize findings in conjunction with blood testing results in your community may have or may get in the future to advocate for blood testing. It's useful to advocate for university community partnership to begin, a real official study, a real full-fledged epidemiological study. That is background-based data. It's also useful, to combine data from the exposed community with similar chemical use, say comparing military versus industrial exposures. How does that compute? It also adds to the undone science on health impacts of PFAS. And lastly, these have been reiterated by Andrea and many others that, for me, you have to let the communities lead the way. We are all learning. And so no one has complete answers. The most important thing is to be inclusive, to be transparent, be innovative in your engagement, listening, be accountable and be restorative, building trust. We still talk and we can email each other. That's, you have to prioritize relationships over everything, building that solidarity and ensuring, equitable, just engagement, bringing community partners at the time of writing grants, and so on. So I know I'm a little over time, so I'll stop here. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Bindu and Laurene. And I want to say to close out, just a huge thank you to all of our speakers and to all of you for joining us for this event. This is the first time that we planned something like this, a PFAS communication event that's focused on communication with communities rather than regulators or the media or other scientists. So thank you all so much, and thanks for staying on a little longer. I wish we could have heard more from all of our amazing speakers tonight. So thanks to all of our event speakers, our organizers and co-sponsors. A lot of people came together to make this happen. About 6 months ago, we started the planning process. So I'm so glad we were able to do this. If you have any questions that weren't answered, feel free to email me and I will get our questions to our speakers and get back to you on those. We have a competition that's the second part of this two-part training. This session was designed to help prepare you to participate in our competition, where you'll have the opportunity to present your PFAS research to PFAS affected community members who will judge your presentations. So it's going to take place in 3 weeks on June 17th. I will follow up via email to share more information. If you did not sign up for the competition before this webinar and are feeling inspired to practice your communication skills, we're opening registration until Monday. So again, I'll follow up via email to let you all know about that. So thank you all so much, and have a great night.
Well, we went over, but not by too much. I think it went really well.